In this video, I'm going to be sharing some key questions for you to ask when you're viewing properties. I'll also be throwing in some bonus tips at the end, so do stick around and I hope you find this useful. This video isn't specifically about mortgages, but if you do have any mortgage related questions, then do chuck them down in the comments and I'll be happy to help. Hi, I'm Sam, I'm a qualified mortgage broker and I'm here to help you in your buying journey. If this is your first time watching, then do consider subscribing to the channel and I'll bring you useful content each week. Before we get into the key questions, I just want to start off by saying that it's key to relax in these situations where you're going out viewing and you're asking the vendor or the estate agent lots and lots of questions. You don't want it to seem like a bit of an interrogation when you're asking all these questions, and it can come in handy if you start building a bit of rapport with the seller as well. We won't be talking through every single question that you could ask a seller or estate agent, but I will be highlighting some of the key questions that you should consider asking. So first off, consider asking how long the seller has actually lived at the property and why it is that they're moving. This can help uncover any potential issues with the property itself or even the area. You might also be able to find out online when the property was last bought and sold. If the property was bought fairly recently, so say within the last 6 months, then that can be a good indication that there's been heavy works carried out to the property, in which case you'd want to make sure that all of the planning permission and building regs are in place. Next up, ask the agent how long the property has been on the market. Now you can sometimes find this information out online as well by looking at Rightmove, Zoopla and so on. If the seller is highly motivated to sell, then you might find that there's a little more wiggle room for your negotiations. So I'd also recommend asking what the neighbours are like. This can be a tricky one because if someone is trying to sell something to you, they're not going to want to go into all of the details of anything negative about the property or the neighbours or the area, but it's always worth asking just in case they let something slip. Next up, you'll want to ask, have there been any issues with the property at all? You want to do a little bit of digging on potential works that need to be carried out, just so that you know what you're getting yourself into. And if you do ask this question, then the estate agents are obliged to tell you if they're aware of any potential issues with the property. Next up, ask if any major works have been carried out to the property. If any major works have been carried out, so say for example if there's been any structural change to the property, such as a loft conversion, then you're going to want to make sure that all of the documentation is in place. So you'll want to see the building regulations, planning permission approval, and any relevant warranties that might apply. A good question to ask is, if the seller was going to stay at the property, is there any works that they would consider carrying out? This is a good way to just dig out any potential issues that the seller would like to fix themselves as well. And if there are no potential issues, then you might just get a good idea of what to do if you do proceed with the purchase when you move in. Either way, it's a good question to ask. Next up, ask the agent if the property is of standard construction. The estate agent should know these details, but an example of standard construction would be brick walls and a tiled roof. Non-standard construction would include concrete builds, thatched cottages and listed buildings. If the property is of non-standard construction, then it can just impact the mortgage products that you're eligible for or which mortgage lender that you choose to proceed with. It's also likely that this will have an impact on your buildings insurance, where it's generally going to be a bit more expensive. If the property is a listed building, then you're likely going to find that there's restrictions on what works you can and can't do. And this would depend on the actual grading of the listed property. So it's good to make sure that you've done the proper research on the property itself. So next up, it's always good to ask, have there been any offers on the property or are there any offers currently pending on the property? If there's been no offers or a very little amount of offers and the property has been on the market for a while, then this may allow a little more wiggle room with your negotiation of the price. On the flip side, if there's been a lot of interest in the property, then you don't want to waste the estate agent's or the vendor's time by offering too low, as you might just get disregarded as a serious buyer, and this could lead to you losing out on the property that you love. It's also worth asking the agent if they have any comparables on the property. So this will be any similar properties in the same area that have sold for a similar price. I'd also recommend carrying out your own research online on the area. And if you can't find any comparable evidence of similar properties at that selling price, and the estate agent can't provide you with any, then it's a good indication that it's priced too high. You can then use this evidence when you come to make an offer on the property. So next up, it's worth asking what the seller's timescales are. This will give you a good indication of any chain involved in the process. So if the seller has an offer accepted on another property, for example, but the seller of that property still needs to find, then this is what's known as a chain. And this can go on and on and on. The longer the chain is, the more complicated the process will be for you and the more risk of potential delays. If there is a big chain involved, then it's worth asking whether the seller would be willing to move out of the property so that you can complete sooner on your purchase. But you might also find that there is no chain and the vendor needs to move very quickly, in which case you want to make sure that all of your finances are in order and you're good to go as quickly as possible. So if you're viewing a flat, then you're going to want to ask what the ground rent and service charge is, if applicable. The higher that these ground rent and service charges are, the more it's going to eat into your affordability. And this can impact the maximum lending that you can get for your mortgage. If you've got sky high service charges and it is still affordable for the mortgage side, it can just make it a little more difficult when you actually come to sell the property. So next you'll want to ask whether the property is leasehold or freehold. Flats are generally leasehold and houses are generally freehold, but this isn't always the case. To put it simply, the longer the lease, the better. If you have a low lease, then you may find that you need to pay for a lease extension later down the line, which can get pretty expensive. A low lease can also impact mortgage eligibility. If the lease is too low for your liking, then you could potentially factor this in to your negotiations, but it's probably already been factored in by the estate agents. So another option may be looking at extending the lease as part of the sale. Another good question is to ask the estate agents if there are any plans for the area. This will give you a good idea of what's going to change in the area going forwards, and it can also sometimes give you an indication of whether or not your property will increase or decrease in value in the future. So next you're going to want to ask what's included in the sale. This might seem like a bit of a silly question because surely you'll just be buying the flat or the house, but you won't necessarily get all of the fixtures and fittings that go with it. So get into the specifics so that you know exactly what you will and won't have. So next is a really quick one. Just ask the seller or the estate agent if you can turn on the taps, because this will allow you to just check the water pressure is right. You'll also want to ask how old the boiler is and when it was last serviced. If the house comes with a very old boiler that has no service history, then that's not ideal. So you potentially need to budget the costs of a new boiler into your purchase, so you may want to factor this in when you come to make an offer. So next, it's worth asking whether or not the seller is currently living in the property or whether it's rented out to tenants. If it is rented out to tenants, then you're going to want to see a copy of the tenancy agreement. If there's not a valid tenancy agreement in place, then this can cause issues further into the buying process. And lastly, it's always worth asking what is the lowest amount that the seller would accept. You might be more comfortable asking the estate agent this question rather than the seller directly, and you won't always get the answer that you'd hope. But you might find that the estate agent gives you an indication of a lower purchase price that the seller might be willing to accept just to get that deal tied up. So that's all of the questions out of the way, but we're going to give you some bonus tips now on what to do when you're out viewing as well. So firstly, it's always best to take someone on the viewing with you. So whether that be a friend or a family member, and if they've got experience in the industry as well, then that's even better. Always go for a second viewing as well, just to make sure that you still love the property, and potentially even to get some measurements if you're looking at any fixtures and fittings that you'd be looking to put in. Ask the seller or the estate agents if you're allowed to take pictures or a video of the property as well, just so that you can refer back to it at the end of the day. If you're viewing lots and lots of properties all in one day, then it's quite easy that all of them will just end up merging into one. Check every corner of the house for damp and cracks, and maybe even behind the sofas or any furniture if the seller allows you to do so. You'll want to check online for the council tax costs and estimated costs of your bills each month, just so that you can factor that into your budget. Or even better, if you're able to speak to the seller directly, they might be able to give you an indication of what these costs are. As a quick tip, just take a walk around the area, just to get a feel for it, just to make sure that you like the place that you'd be potentially moving to. It's good to check if there's parking nearby, not just for yourself, but for family and friends if they're going to come and visit. And it's also good to check how close the transport links are. You might also want to check if there's any shops or restaurants or pubs or gyms nearby that you can get to fairly easily. Always check the schools in the local area if you have kids or you're planning to have kids. If possible, have a chat with the neighbours as well, because you'll get a general idea of the area and the properties from someone that isn't trying to sell it to you. Check the EPC register. Now EPC stands for Energy Performance Certificate. Each property will have one, and it's a rating of how energy efficient the property is. Of course, the more efficient the property, the better, but it can also impact some mortgage products that you'd be eligible for. And lastly, I always ask my clients to send me links to properties of interest before they put an offer in, just so I can give the property a once over. This way I can make sure that there's nothing that stands out from a lender's perspective that might limit the lenders available or the particular mortgage products. And I can also help with guidance on what questions should be asked. So let's hear from you. Are there any questions that I've missed that you would ask? Do let me know in the comments. If you'd like any further information at all, please don't hesitate to leave me a comment or contact me directly. All links are in the description below. Before I let you go, I am obliged to tell you that as a mortgage is secured against your home, it may be repossessed if you don't keep up the mortgage repayments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.